A narration from the book Eat Like You Care. But what if we treated food animals just as we treat our pets? This is a variant on the "but what if we improve the treatment of animals we use for food" argument. It recognizes that we cannot treat animals humanely as long as we are engaged in factory farming or even smaller farming. And it therefore asks the following. If we had a cow or a couple of chickens, raised them in our backyards, treated them just as we do our dogs, cats, or other animal companions whom we regard as members of our family, and slaughtered them painlessly, what would be wrong with eating them or products made from them? There are 4 replies here. First, as a practical matter, it would be largely impossible to raise and slaughter animals without some considerable pain and suffering being involved, even under the most ideal circumstances. That gets us back to the idea that less suffering is certainly better than more suffering, but that if we regard animals as having any moral value, we need to be able to justify any pain and suffering we impose. Secondly, as a psychological matter, this suggestion is most unrealistic. We would not eat animals if we thought of them in the way that we think about our dogs, cats, and other companion animals. We knew a couple who decided that they wanted to continue to eat animal products, but that they were going to produce their meat, milk, and eggs themselves on a small farm they had. They triumphantly declared that they could raise and kill animals without making them suffer any more than did their dogs and cats whom they loved and whose interests they always sought to protect. We were skeptical precisely because we knew once they treated cows, pigs, and chickens with the same sort of attitude that characterized their treatment of their dog and cats, they would be unable to eat those animals just as they would not eat their dogs and cats. And that is precisely what happened. About 2 years, they gave up the farm and stopped eating all animal products. They said, quote unquote, they became family, we just couldn't eat them. For those of us who live with animal companions, the thought of eating them never crosses our mind. If we started relating to food animals in the way in which we related to our non-human companions, we would not eat them either. That's the point. If the light goes on and we see that we are all Michael Vick, the thing to do is stop being Michael Vick and stop consuming animal products altogether. The solution is not to restructure things to treat animals we are going to eat as we treat dogs and cats. Third, as a philosophical matter, this question assumes that if we were able to use animals without making them suffer, our painlessly killing an animal does not in itself amount to harming the animal. This is a marked contrast to how we think about humans. Yes, suffering is bad, but we view death, even a painless one, as a bad thing. We humans have an interest in continuing to live. Death frustrates that interest, which is separate from an interest in not suffering. We don't want to suffer. We also don't want to die. Animals, many say, don't want to suffer, but they don't care about dying unless the act of killing involves suffering. It is the suffering that is the problem for animals, not the killing. This idea, in one form or another, has been around for hundreds of years. The moral intuition that we now all accept that animals matter morally, but less than humans, and that we can use animals when it is necessary to do so as long as we minimize suffering, was an idea that emerged in the 19th century. It assumed that it was acceptable to use animals when necessary because, unlike humans, they are not self-aware and have no interest in continuing to live. That is, they do not prefer or desire or want to remain alive. That idea, which most certainly makes us feel better about killing animals for food, was crazy in the 19th century. It is crazy now. To say that any sentient being is not harmed by death is most peculiar. Sentience is not a characteristic that has evolved to serve as an end in itself. Rather, it is a trait that allows beings to identify situations that are harmful and that threaten survival. Sentience is a means to the end of continued existence. Sentient beings, by virtue of their being sentient, have an interest in remaining alive. That is, they prefer, want, or desire to remain alive. To say that a sentient being is not harmed by death denies that the being has the very interest that sentience serves to perpetuate. It would be analogous to say that a being with eyes does not have an interest in continuing to see, or is not harmed by being made blind. The Jains of India expressed it well long ago. I love the Jains, by the way. All beings are fond of life, like pleasure, hate pain, shun destruction, like life, long to live. To all life is dear. The notion that animals are not self-aware is based on nothing more than a stipulation that the only way to be self-aware is to have the self-awareness of a normal adult human. That is certainly one way to be self-aware. It's not the only way. As biologist Donald Griffin, one of the most important cognitive ethologists of the 20th century, noted in his book, Animal Minds, if animals are conscious of anything, the animal's own body and its own actions must fall within the scope of its perceptual consciousness. We nevertheless deny animals self-awareness because we maintain that they cannot think such thoughts as, "It is I who am suffering," or "climbing this tree," or "chasing that moth." Griffin maintains that when an animal consciously perceives the running, climbing, or moth chasing of another animal, it must also be aware of who is doing these things. And if the animal is perceptually conscious of its own body, it is difficult to rule out similar cognition that it itself is doing the running, climbing, or chasing. He concludes that if animals are capable of perceptual awareness, denying them some level of self-awareness would seem to be an arbitrary and unjustified restriction. It would seem that any sentient being must be self-aware, in that to be sentient means to be the sort of being who recognizes that it is that being and not some other being who is aware. When a sentient being is in pain or distress, that being necessarily recognizes that it is she or he and not some other who is in pain or distress. There is someone who is conscious of being in pain and who has a preference not to have that experience. Even if animals live in some sort of eternal present, which we doubt to be the case, that still does not mean that they are not self-aware, that they have no interest in continued existence, or that death does not harm them. It just means that their self-awareness is different. Animals would still have a sense of themselves in each particular moment. They would still want to get to the next moment of the present. Their sense of self-awareness may be different from that of a normal adult human, but it would not be accurate to say that they are not self-aware or that they are indifferent to death. We see this where humans are involved. If a human is mentally disabled and is not self-aware in the same way that a normal human is, we do not think that such a human is without an interest in life or that death is not a harm to him or her. She or he may be self-aware in some different way than others, but is still self-aware in a morally relevant way, so that we would regard treating her or him exclusively as a resource, which is how we treat non-human animals used for food, as morally wrong. In sum, if a being is sentient, that is, if she is perceptually aware, then she has an interest in continuing to live and death harms her. It is not necessary to have the autobiographical sense of self that we associate with normal adult humans in order to be self-aware. As a human-like sense of self-awareness, it is not necessary to have an interest in continuing to live. Fourth, let's get back to practicality. Even if everything we just said were completely wrong, and it were possible to have animal agriculture with the animals being treated like dogs and cats, not suffering at all, and being allowed to die of old age, the reality is that products made from such animals are simply not available now in the world in which we live. So what difference does it make to your choice about what to eat tonight? The answer is clear. None. There are some people who, when they find out we don't consume milk or anything from anyone who had eyes or a mother, will tell us a story about their great-grandparents' cow who was treated as a member of the family. Although we do not accept as an empirical matter that the cow in the family farm situation did not suffer, our usual follow-up is not to argue that point, but to ask what happened to the baby cows who were born as the result of having this cow be pregnant regularly so she would continue to produce milk. The reason why we ask this question is that we know the answer. The males were sold as veal calves, as were some of the females. The rest of the females became dairy cows. This undercuts the argument that there is no suffering in the family farm situation in a way that most people can understand. But there's always the person who comes back with, all of the babies were allowed to live on the farm and were never sent to slaughter. I'm telling you, these cows never suffered. Again, there are many things that could be said in response to this wildly fantastical characterization, but among the most efficient time-wise is to ask, do you have any access to the milk made in that way now? The answer is always no. Our reply is always, so even if that were all true, what relevance does it have to your decision now to consume milk? The response is always either an acknowledgement that the hypothetical situation is meaningless in terms of our actual moral behavior, or a mark expressing irritation, indicative of the fact that we have asked a question that cannot be answered in a satisfactory way. A related responsive but we get at this point is, but what if I rescued and adopted a chicken and treated her as I would my dog or cat? Would it be all right to eat her eggs? Putting aside that such a system could not supply eggs to many people unless we all adopted chickens, the reality is that because chickens have been bred to lay such an unnatural number of eggs, their bodies are depleted of nutrients, and the chickens will often and usually eat their own eggs once they realize that they are not fertilized. And hens often become very distressed when their eggs are taken. So in the very best case scenario, which certainly would not supply any quantity of eggs as a commercial matter, we end up taking eggs that the hens need for themselves and putting them in situations in which they suffer distress. And unless we are going to keep them until they die of natural causes, which can be 10 years or more after egg production wanes, we will end up killing them. The bottom line is clear. There is no way to produce animal products, whether meat, dairy, or eggs, without suffering under the best of circumstances and death. It just can't be done. And if it is not necessary for us to consume animal products, then we cannot justify even a greatly reduced level of suffering and more humane death on the non-existent Old MacDonald's farm. Just as we would agree that a more quote-unquote humane dog-fighting operation would not make Michael Vick's conduct justifiable. To hear the next chapter, please go to my next video on my YouTube page. Please like and subscribe.